when we began Ardis, we never saw our readers. We saw our writers. We saw the people that we were publishing. But we didn't come in contact with our real readers, the people who got the smuggled books in their hands in Siberia, for example, the people who took copies of Nabokov and Bulgakov and Brodsky to the Ukraine, for example. We knew our little worlds in Leningrad and Moscow, where all the writers were and people connected to them, and they were very excited about Ardis. But of course, they weren't exactly the people we were doing it for. And we met those people only a couple of times in our life. Carl only met them once, unfortunately. And that was the first Moscow book fair in 1977, where with great difficulty we managed to get in and get our books in, including Lolita, which was then banned. This was an unbelievable event for Carl and me because it was the first time we saw those people, our real readers. And what they turned out to be was people who were willing to wait in lines that were 4 hours long to get into a tiny 5x9 space and look at our books, to hold those books in their hands, whether they were in English or Russian, actually. It didn't seem to matter to them. For example, we had a biography of Yesenin, the Russian poet who had been married to Isadora Duncan, and we had great photographs in those books. And in general, we were always interested in photographs, which the other publishers weren't so much. We did a lot of photobiographies. This was one of my sidelines, was that I did all these photobiography books. So we had this book with all these great pictures of the true Russian national poet Yesenin, who wasn't published much in those years, and they never saw the pictures. And we had the picture that was forbidden by the Soviet censorship of Yesenin after his suicide. Well, everybody who came into the stand, this tiny little stand, wanted to read the books. They wanted to stand there and read them. And we had to keep sort of saying, no, you know, people are waiting 3 and 4 hours. You've really got to go on now. 20 minutes is it. And they would take Nabokov in their hands, or they would take Brodsky. And the fair people didn't know that what books we had until much later when the KGB came around. Because I had kind of pulled a fast one when the books got there. I hid some, because there was an inspector who came through to censor the books as you took them out of the boxes. Okay, that fair was an amazing event. And Carl and I were at that, and he was fully aware of what a remarkable thing it was to meet people from all over the country who come to Moscow for the book fair, somehow gotten there, and were standing in line, and they knew our books. And even the ones who didn't know our books, they heard about them from other people at the fair. Because everybody would go, let's go to the art books at Thames and Hudson, the English firm, because I knew they would have beautiful art books that the Russians didn't have, of modern art specifically. And then people would say, what are the other places where people are standing in line? Of course, it would be the American booths of the big America magazine, and ours. And we were way off with the socialist countries where they tended to want to put us, you know, next to the Czech minor publishers of Marx. So you'd see nobody in this huge, huge exhibition hall, and then you'd see this huge line around the artist's booth going all the way down the center of this huge building. So that was the one time for Carl. After he died, well, we had been banned from Russia. He was banned from Russia after the Metropole affair. I'll talk about Metropole's right here. I'll talk about this. Okay, so when we published this book, actually, Metropole, in Russian, you'll notice something odd about it. It's very big. Published this in 1979. We took it right from their typescript. Their typescript came to us in huge, huge sheets like this, because they wanted to make the point that they were not trying to do an underground book. This is an anthology, later came out in English, of young and very well-known Russian writers. And it wasn't particularly political in any sense, but it had not gone through the censorship, and the major writers in there, like Voznесensky and Aksionov and so on, had joined with the younger writers. And they wanted to publish something. They thought the time was right. It was 79. They wanted to publish something that was genuinely exciting in a literary way, that they didn't consider pornographic or political in the wrong sense. Real literature. Well, of course, this was fated to end badly, and it ended badly for most of the writers, some of whom lost pensions, lost access to medical care with the Writers' Union. Other people lost their jobs, and we lost access to Russia. They let me in 1980 and denied Karl because I think they really thought that women didn't count. They didn't understand I was his full partner. So they let me in, and then after that trip, they published a couple articles about me saying that I'd come to Moscow promising mounds of gold and worldwide fame to these poor Russian writers. Anyway, so after that, they wouldn't let me in. And when Karl died, of course, Russia learned about it from the Voice of America and the BBC. And they still didn't let me in. Not only didn't let me in, didn't let my girlfriend Tanya come out to the funeral, which was really the hardest thing. But anyway, after that, the next book fair that we were into was 1989. Now, we had not been there since '77 at the book fair. Everything had changed, except one thing. They held up my visa. This was under Gorbachev, Glasnost, Russia was shifting. Didn't matter. I was still on the list of the KGB, and it took all the American publishers getting together and saying, we will not open our booths if you don't let her in, to get me in. I came 3 days late with my daughter, and my staff was already there, and everybody was fighting to get me in, and no one could do it. Until finally Robert Bernstein, who was the head of Random House, and was always very good to artists in different ways, fought and told the Soviets, and he was no friend of theirs. He said, if you don't let her in, we'll close down our part of the fair, and what will this fair be without the Americans? And Random House is one of the biggest publishers in the world, so this was a serious threat. So I came in, now Karl had died in '84, and I came in with my staff for this book fair. It was so different. It was profoundly different. People were still standing in line, but they had access to much more. And as I was signing up, I remember I was just signing into the book fair, and the young guy taking the sign up, he said, is Ellendea Proffer with your delegation? I said, I'm Ellendea Proffer. And he said, you're Ellendea Proffer? I said, yeah. And then he proceeded to lose his mind in all kinds of ways. And I understood that they were free to say what they wanted now. He told me what artists had meant to him, and he was quite young. I think he was about 27. A lot of that happened. It was a different world in that people could kind of bribe their way past censorship. We had our books kind of confiscated for that fair, but I went down and made deals with the guys holding it, and I got, I think, almost everything, except maybe Lolita, back on the stand. And it was a truly remarkable display of how much things had changed, in that people had access to more, and they were freer to ask us questions, whereas at the first one in '77, they were desperate to ask us things like they would ask me how Yesenin really died, and so on, but they were frightened to do it. It's like it was torn out of them. This time, people would come up, they'd give you their cards, they'd say, call me if you need help with this or that. There were a lot of KGB agents in the crowd. They were always checking us, but it was not the same thing. And although they were following us all during this couple weeks of the fair, it just didn't feel as dangerous anymore. And after that, I think artists went in a lot of new directions when Glasnost came, which is all basically, unfortunately, after Karl died, he had written one essay called Two Literatures or One, a speech he had actually given at USC during the Third Wave Conference in '77, and he ended this speech by saying, it's clear to everyone what you do when you have a tyranny and how you overthrow a tyranny. And if you want freedom, what are the necessary steps? But he didn't think Russia would do it. Most of us didn't. There were just a few people, like Andrei Malraux, who wrote that famous book, Will the Soviet Union Survive to 1984? And as we know, it didn't quite, fall apart in '84. It fell apart more like '88. But so Karl didn't live to see this, and these changes were stunning for us at Ardis, and stunning for me personally. The Metropole people came back to power. They were all on television. It was as if the world had turned upside down. Ardis has had several evenings in its honor. During the worst stages of adaptation to the new economy, of course, people didn't read literature, and they weren't interested in books. They were interested only in journalism. This is what happens when structures fall. This happened in Argentina when the generals left. It happened in Spain when Franco died. There's a period when societies have to have journalism. They have to find out everything they can, and they're not interested in literature. So we went into a couple areas. One was a really remarkable book, which I think has been translated now by Vladimir Papierny, called Kultura 2. And it's about socialist realist architecture, and that it wasn't some bizarre construct. It grew out of certain true needs of the Russian soul in the 30s. And it's a fascinating book, and it's about two cultures. He calls them Culture 1 and Culture 2. This fascination, for example, with the Gothic in the 30s in Germany and Russia and so on. So we published this huge book, which I think we sold maybe 200 copies of, but it was immensely influential on the debate within Russian architecture circles. We published a book called The 1960s by two Russian journalists, about the generation of the 60s, which is the generation that formed the young people who came to power as Gorbachev loosened the reins. So we went into a lot of other areas besides literature, although we continued with literature. And then, of course, we got on the web, and we get email now from Russia. The idea that one day you would get email from somebody behind the Iron Curtain, or that there would be faxes sent from China during Tiananmen, this was amazing to us. This is just something we could never have foreseen. And so now that Ardis is an allowable entity, of course, we're much less exciting to them in a way. And our main production is in English now, whereas before it used to be at least 1/3 to 1/2 in Russian language. We do very little in the Russian language now, because Russia does it in the Russian language. Not always well, but they reach their market. But what we are now is one of the outlets for main Russian translations and language materials. And in Russia, they always asked me, in these last 5 years, understanding that the fall of communism meant the fall of Ardis's Russian branch. They said, don't you feel bad about that? And I said, no, because the English part is what let us keep on going publishing the Russian part, because there weren't that many readers here that would buy the Russian texts. It would be diplomats and Russians who were traveling who would take them back. I said, but you know, even if that had been our main business, the idea that you have the freedom to publish these books now in an uncensored form, this is what we've always wanted for you. How could we be unhappy that you finally have got freedom of the press? You know, this was like such a wonderful development.